Well, the Big 12 is holding spring meetings this week, and conference expansion is the big topic. Where does Gonzaga fit in, and what, if anything, is holding up a potentially seismic move in college basketball?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to give you daily reports through another offseason of Gonzaga athletics. Well, we are all over the Big 12's reported discussions about conference realignment, which involve Gonzaga. They involve UConn, San Diego State, a handful of schools from the Pac-12 as well. We're going to cover all of that. We're also going to talk about 2025 prospect, that the Zags are interested in. That's Jalen Haralson. And we're going to recap the Gonzaga baseball season and talk about a few transfer portal things that have already happened with that program here on a Friday edition of the Locked On Zags podcast. Hope you all are having a solid start to the month of June and are going to have a good weekend here coming up. But we got to talk about the Big 12 because I've been hesitant to try to dig too much into every single time this conversation kind of crops back up, because ultimately, a lot of the times that we see new reports on this, we see new updates, they're kind of non-updates. And I don't want to be of the I'll believe it when I see it type ilk. Like, I don't want to wait to not talk about this until it actually happens, because we want to try to figure out what is happening, what are the changes, is how much of this is smoke, how much of this is fire, how much is actually kind of going on. A recent quote from the athletic director at the University of Colorado, who is, of course, a huge player in this realignment conversation, basically said to believe about 1/3 of what you see published out there, which I think is a decently accurate way to think about it. And I don't think it's because 2/3 of people reporting information are doing so out of bad faith or anything like that. I think it's so constantly evolving and changing and moving, and these conversations are taking things in so many different directions that I think constantly talking about it, it's not really adding anything to the conversation unless something has considerably changed. But there's enough that's happened recently and enough momentum right now towards some changes that I think it's worth re-exploring where we are at right now with Gonzaga and the Big 12. First things first, the Big 12 is hosting their spring meetings Wednesday through Friday. So as you are listening to this, they are either wrapping up their meetings or on the final day of those meetings. Part of the general crux of these meetings, from what we have been told and heard, is that it is about conference realignment. I am sure there are other things that they cover in these spring meetings. I'm sure every conference has meetings similar to this, but the general gist for the Big 12 right now is conference realignment. And the reason for that is fairly simple. Brett Yormark, the new commissioner of the Big 12, I say new, he's been there about a year now. He had 3 goals when he took over as the commissioner. His goals were to get a new media rights deal secured, which he has done through ESPN and Fox, to get Texas and Oklahoma out of the Big 12 in some kind of agreeable manner, which he has done. They found a way to get them out a year early and send them on their way to the SEC, and then to expand. So 2 out of 3 are already done for Commissioner Yormark, and the third one is what he is working on right now. Gonzaga has had conversations with the Big 12, and the Big 12 has also had conversations with Navigate, which is a consulting firm hired by Gonzaga for the specific purpose of looking at how Gonzaga could advance to a Power 5 conference. Navigate has worked with 4 of the 5 Power 5 conferences, and their whole company exists effectively to help look at conference realignment and whether these smaller schools could jump into the Big 12, into the Power 5 conference level. And then, of course, teams moving amongst the Power 5 conferences as well. So this is the perfect company to be working with Gonzaga. And the fact that Gonzaga has already had direct conversations with the Big 12 and the Big 12 has had direct conversations with Navigate, like, for anybody who's wondering if there's not a lot of momentum here, there's plenty of momentum here. Whether it's going to get announced over the weekend, later this month, a year from now, those are things that I don't know. I'm leaning towards it being sooner rather than later for a handful of reasons. We know the Big 12 is interested in a bunch of different schools. They're losing Texas and Oklahoma. They are adding 4 schools, BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF are the 4 schools that are all coming in. And that's going to put them at 14. They want to be at 16. They might want to be at 18 or 20. Brett Yormark does not seem to be constrained by the amount of schools in his conference. The more, the merrier, seems to be the attitude. Of course, he's not the only decision maker. Presidents and athletic directors are going to have a huge say in some of these conversations, and continuing to split the revenue is not something that a lot of these programs are probably going to be interested in doing. But we know that Gonzaga is a target. We know that UConn is a target, which, man, if the Big 12 can find a way to add both Gonzaga and UConn and have powerhouse college basketball programs on either coast, while the majority of the rest of their programs reside in the middle of the country, you have a conference that has Baylor, Kansas, Houston, UConn, and Gonzaga. What are those teams going to finish 5th in their conference? Think about that. That is insane. And that's not even factoring in teams like Iowa State, teams like TCU, teams like West Virginia. Like, there's a lot of really good basketball in the Big 12 already. And Gonzaga and UConn being rumored additions right now really changes that equation. However, the big thing remains, and the reason that I say I'm hesitant to talk about this until something changes is because there's one thing that needs to change before any domino falls, and that's the Pac-12's media rights deal. Until that happens, I'm not sure there's going to be any movement. I don't think the Big 12 will add Gonzaga or UConn until they know what is going on with the Pac-12 conference. They've basically said that, and I understand why. Because Colorado and Arizona State and Utah, which are I think more on the periphery, the impression that I am getting from listening to the fantastic Locked On Pac-12 podcast, for those of you who haven't checked it out, as well as reading as many articles about this as I can find, is that Colorado is kind of waffling. They seem the most likely to potentially jump ship and join the Big 12. Deion Sanders wants to get back in Texas. Don't blame him for that. Arizona seems to be a bit waffly as well. Arizona State and Utah seem more inclined to stay in the Pac-12. But again, none of this really matters until we know what the Pac-12's media rights deal looks like. I suspect that will happen before the end of June for one significant reason. The San Diego State Aztecs have to pay the Mountain West an exorbitant amount of money for an exit fee if they are not added to a new conference prior to June 30th. The Pac-12 wants to add San Diego State. They should want to add San Diego State. They're losing their 2 schools in the Southern California market in USC and UCLA. Getting another program in that market, or at least adjacent to that market in San Diego, with the kind of basketball pedigree that they have, a solid enough football program, a good brand awareness and recognition, makes a ton of sense. San Diego State to the Pac-12 makes perfect sense. But Brett Yormark is not going to sit around and watch a really, really valuable, coveted program just go to some other conference because they are more geographically local to them. They're not going to do that. Yormark's totally willing to wait it out and see if they can potentially poach San Diego State. And the Pac-12 is not doing anything to prevent that from happening until they reveal that media rights deal. If that deal comes out and Colorado, Arizona State, Utah all say, hey, this is good enough for us, we're in, and the Pac-12 can turn around and add San Diego State and get up to 11, they'll probably look to add somebody else, whether that's Southern Methodist, whether it's Tulane, whether it's somebody else in the Mountain West Conference, Boise State, Fresno State, somebody like that. All that remains to be seen. But if that happens, if the if the Pac-12 is able to keep their 10-member schools together and potentially add a school like San Diego State, that's best case scenario for the Pac-12. It's probably best case scenario for Gonzaga too, because if that happens, the Big 12 is going to pivot their attention to adding Gonzaga and UConn. Why wouldn't they? There are still some snags that need to be figured out. The biggest one is revenue distribution. UConn is technically a football school. They are in the Big East. They do play independent, but they hired Jim Mora. They had some success last year, and they're going to come into the Big 12 with their football school in tow. So from a revenue distribution perspective, they're going to get that piece of the pie because they have a football program. Gonzaga does not. They will not get that same piece of the pie. There's going to need to be some kind of negotiation where Gonzaga gets a piece of the pie that is worth it for them financially to make this move, where they are suddenly traveling 3, 4, 5 times as much for every single one of their athletic programs. It has to be worth it for them financially because they're getting a pretty good deal on the WCC right now. And while the Big 12 is certainly better from a brand awareness perspective, from a competition perspective, all of the stuff that matters on the basketball court, money is still a relevant factor here. And if Gonzaga is going to move to the Big 12 and get a bigger piece of the pie, but it's basically canceled out by all the extra travel, that may not be something they are interested in doing. So those are the conversations that need to happen. Those are and to be clear, they are happening. I'm not saying that they haven't happened yet. They probably have a very good idea of what that looks like, and just haven't quite dotted all the I's and crossed the T's and all that stuff. That's where I kind of think things are at right now, because they're waiting to figure out if, the alternative solution here, if the Pac-12 dissolves, which is probably extreme, but if the Pac-12 loses Colorado and Arizona, if those two schools say, hey, we're done, we're going to the Big 12. Is the Big 12 also then going to add Gonzaga and UConn? I think they would like to, but can they pull that off? Is the Pac-12 going to pivot really hard and try to get Gonzaga? I think probably not, but maybe. There's a lot of factors here, and until we see this Pac-12 media rights deal, I'm not really willing to put a rubber stamp on anything. I have maintained on this podcast that I think Gonzaga is going to join the Big 12 conference, and I think it's going to happen relatively soon, but relatively soon could be a year from now. And until we see what's going on with the Pac-12, until we have some kind of financial inclination, or until Colorado says, hey, we're good, we're staying, or hey, we're gone, we want to join the Big 12 again, we're done with this conference, that is kind of the big hinge here. And it's not just Colorado. The other four corner schools, as they are often called, Utah, Arizona State, and Arizona, they all have an impact here as well. Technically, Oregon and Washington could try to find a way into the Big Ten, which has been discussed as well, though it doesn't sound like the Big Ten is necessarily making any imminent moves, but there's still a lot of things that could potentially change this conversation. I maintain Gonzaga to the Big 12 is going to happen. My opinion of that has not changed. This has made me think it's more likely to happen sooner rather than later, like potentially within the next month. I really do believe that could be announced and that could happen. But it's still contingent on a lot of things that right now just have not been answered. And until they are, I don't know that much will change in regards to this conversation at this point. Well, Gonzaga is making a strong push for a 2025 combo guard by the name of Jalen Haralson. He could end up being the best player in that entire recruiting class. More on his game and why Gonzaga is so interested coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back, and there is no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you do not win. Maybe you Zag fans want to bet on Marco Gonzalez to get a win for the Mariners, or perhaps you want to bet on Eli Morgan to snag a save for the Cleveland Guardians. Either way, don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. For those of you who are checking us out on our brand new look YouTube channel, thanks again for hanging out with us this weekend, or this week into the weekend. Every dayers next week, we're going to continue to talk about realignment as it continues to come up. If we get any updates over the weekend from how these Big 12 conversations went, we're going to continue to look at Drew Timme and Julian Strother's NBA draft chances, teams they're working out with, potentially good fits for them, not so good fits for them, all of that good stuff. We're also going to continue to keep an eye on the transfer portal as players like Zion Mullan continue to name Gonzaga in their top 5, what it might mean for this roster next season, all here on the Locked On Zags podcast. If you want to become an everyday listener, very simple. Just go hit that subscribe button on YouTube, over 1,700 right now. I would love to get to 2,000 before the start of the college basketball season. So if you haven't done so yet, just go to YouTube and hit that button. All right, folks, talking about a 2025 incoming recruit, a player that Gonzaga has shown some interest in, a 6'7" combo guard from Fishers, Indiana. His name is Jalen Haralson. Right now at 24/7 Sports, Haralson is the number 10 ranked player in the class of 2025. If you use their composite rankings, he is up to 9th. He's the number 1 ranked combo guard in the class and the number 1 player in the state of Indiana. Really highly touted, highly talented guard. A couple articles written about him, one at 24/7 Sports, one at Stock Risers, that had some interviews with him. He was asked which schools are involved with him right now. This is what he said, direct quote: Indiana, Gonzaga, Duke, Purdue, UConn, Iowa, Auburn, Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, and some others. That's a pretty darn good list. That's the list that you would expect of teams to be interested in a player ranked that high in his recruiting class. Haralson also did offer some thoughts on Gonzaga. He was asked to kind of give quotes on each of the teams that had showed interest in him. This is what he said, direct quote. I'm taking this from an article at Stock Risers about Gonzaga. Quote, "They love how I operate in the ball screen game. Gonzaga has a guard-based offense that sets the other four players on the floor up for success, and I'm one of the best in my class at setting others up. I love confident kids. I love that. I love that he says, this is what Gonzaga's good at. This is what I'm good at." Because at the end of the day, like, Gonzaga's pursuing you, but you have to sell yourself as well. Like, you have to prove that you're capable of playing with that team in that level. And normally, if you're a top 10 recruit in your recruiting class, you can kind of sit on your laurels a little bit and just let teams come to you. But I love that he goes out there and says, I am the best at this. He said one of the best, but like, he knows what he said. I'm one of the best in my class at doing this thing that Gonzaga values. Like, I love saying that out loud, because you're trying to sell yourself. You're trying to indicate, this is what I'm capable of doing. And I mean, he's right about everything that he said. Gonzaga does use the ball screen game a lot. They use their guards to set up their other players. They kind of went away from that a little bit last year, in part because Drew Timme was capable of kind of running the offense himself, and because the guards were not as competent in that area as I think that many guards in Gonzaga's past have been. We'll put it that way. Of course, they bring in a player like Ryan Nembhard, who's one of the best distributors and facilitators in college basketball. That's going to change the equation for them significantly next season. Not really a factor for Haralson. He's not going to be on anybody's campus until 2025 unless he reclassifies. But this is an exciting update for Gonzaga, and in part because we haven't heard a lot of recruiting updates. It's kind of a dead period for that right now anyway, so it's not anything surprising necessarily, but Gonzaga has been so focused on making additions in the transfer portal and certainly helping to replenish their immediate needs on this roster after losing 6 players. Is that right? 7 players from this roster. So the priority was like, let's just get more bodies who are going to be on this team in 2023. And they go out and they get Steel Venters. They go out and they get Ryan Nembhard. They go out and they get Graham Ike. They're continuing to be involved in other transfers. We talked about Zion Mullan on Thursday's episode of Locked On Zags and how he listed Gonzaga in his top 5. So they've been pretty focused on finding players who can join this team next year. And that's what you need to do when you lose 3 players to the transfer portal and 3 players to the NBA or to the professional ranks, and then 1 player to graduation in Rasir Bolton. You need to replenish your roster. But now, as things slow down a little bit, as the NBA draft declaration period passes, as transfer portal stuff starts to kind of wind down, Gonzaga's got 2 scholarships left. I suspect they're only going to fill one of them. Now you can start to turn your attention a little bit more so to that recruiting world. Haralson's a guy who's not going to be on any college campuses for a while, but it's nice to see Gonzaga out there and looking at top 10 caliber guys, because for most of Gonzaga's history, they haven't recruited the premier American high school talent. Now they have. Yeah, obviously there's local programs involved with him already. Like, maybe he wants to stay home. I don't know what the situation is going to be with Haralson, but the fact that Gonzaga's invested, the fact that he's talking about Gonzaga as a program that shares his kind of affinity for basketball, shares his skill set or values his skill set in his mind. Like, those are the kind of conversations I'm glad we're still having, even if we're not, even if we don't land this kid. I think it's important for the staff to still be out there looking at these high level recruits. And they're still involved in other players. Zoom Diallo is a player that has been connected to Gonzaga for a really long time. He's most recent update on him is that he's down to 6 schools, including Gonzaga, as well as Florida State, Kansas, Arizona, USC, and the Washington Huskies. He did move. He is playing his senior year of high school, not at Curtis High School in Tacoma, Washington, which is where he began his career, but he has transferred to Prolific Prep in California, a really high-level basketball school. I don't know that this means much Yes, it's closer to USC. Technically, it's closer to Arizona as well. I don't know that really matters. He's going to play with higher level players. He might get more exposure. I mean, he will. He will get more exposure. Perhaps that brings some other programs in on his recruiting, but I don't think that changes where Gonzaga is necessarily. I think they still have a really good chance of landing him. He's a really, really talented kid. He'd probably step into a potential starting role for this Gonzaga team right away if he were to commit to the program. We'll continue to have more updates on recruiting as we see more of it happen. Again, it's been relatively quiet up to this point, but as we get into June, as we get farther and farther away from transfer portal stuff, as we get farther away from last season, I think that recruiting stuff is going to be a big part of Locked On Zags. So definitely keep us plugged in, keep us on your schedule, stay subscribed on YouTube if you still are, or go hit that button if you haven't done so already, because we have a ton of recruiting stuff to come this summer, as well as everything else going on with this Gonzaga program. But right now, I want to talk about the Gonzaga baseball team, because they kind of finished the season on a low note, and they've already lost a few players to the transfer portal. And I want to know, is this cause for concern about Gonzaga baseball? More of that coming up right after this. Well, Gonzaga baseball finished their season, and it, to be perfectly honest, was a bit of a disappointment. Coming off of a couple of really, really nice seasons. So winning a regional last year, kind of had this momentum of an up-and-coming program, a program that was finally starting to make some noise in the playoffs, and this year did not. They just didn't have it. They just didn't have it. That's really the best that we can say about it. And they really limped to the finish line. They lost their final 7 games. In fact, in the month of May, they went 1-10. In the month of May, it started with a 2 of 3 loss to St. Mary's. They won 1 game against the Gales, lost the other 2. That was at home. And they brought Oklahoma, which is a very good powerhouse program. They brought Oklahoma to Spokane for a 3-game series and got swept. In those 3 games, they went on the road to play Santa Clara to close out the WCC regular season. Santa Clara took all 3 of those. That meant that they ended up facing Santa Clara again in the WCC tournament, and they lost there to end their season. Finished the year with an 18-34 record. That includes 14-13 in conference play. They did play a very tough non-conference schedule. So I think seeing them not do as well in the non-conference isn't super alarming, but they barely finished 500 in the WCC, and that's a decline from where they've been the last couple of years. This team also went 5-22 on the road, really struggled away from Patterson Complex in Spokane. And the thing is, normally for Gonzaga, the hitting is not so good, but the pitching kind of carries them. And it was the opposite this year. Their hitting was good. As a team, they hit 268 with the batting average. They had a 350 on base percentage, 394 slugging percentage. A couple of guys that really stood out to me, Brian Calmer was just excellent this year. He hit 358. He had 15 home runs. That's 9 more than anybody else on the team. He also had 51 RBIs. Sam Stem had a fantastic season as well. He hit 317. He had 10 doubles and 31 RBIs. But the problem for Gonzaga's baseball team was the pitching. And it's not shocking to see the pitching take a step back from last year's roster, because last year's team was loaded in the pitching rotation. Gabriel Hughes is carving people up for the Spokane Indians right now in the Colorado Rockies system. 10th overall pick in the draft, and he looks like it. Tristan Vreeling was a stud last year. He's in the New York Yankees system. He was a 3rd-round pick by them. William Kempner was their 3rd starter last year. He's with the San Francisco Giants. He's kind of a quick riser guy. They've put him in the bullpen and let him throw 99-mile-an-hour cheese. They also lost Brody Jesse, who got drafted, I think, in the 19th round or so by the Cincinnati Reds. 4 pitchers, all off of the roster from last year. And the guys they added in, the guys they brought in to replace them, just weren't on that same level. In fact, for the Gonzaga baseball team last year, they only had 1 pitcher, period. Regardless of innings pitched, they only had 1 pitcher who finished with an ERA below 5. Above 4 is considered, 4-ish is considered average. Above 4.5 is considered bad. They only had 1 pitcher below 5. And that was Owen Wild, who was expected to be their ace this year, and he was. And he threw 95 innings, but he finished with a 4.93 ERA. So we mentioned only 1 guy with an ERA below 5, barely. This team they just struggled with pitching. And that's unusual for this program. Now, I have a ton of confidence in friend of the program, Brandon Harmon, the associate head coach for Gonzaga and their pitching coach. And I believe that these things will turn around for this program. But man, it was not good this last year. They did not, the bullpen just really struggled. They could not bring anybody into a game to help them get out of a situation. And you saw it. You saw situations where they would ride their starter for too long. They'd leave a guy in for 7-8 innings, even if he was struggling, even if his pitch count was high, because they didn't have anybody to bring in. Depth on this program was an issue last year. And building a baseball roster is hard. And continuity year to year, really hard. This team lost a ton of talent from last year's roster. They brought in junior college guys. They brought in high-profile transfers. They brought in high school players, hoping, hey, maybe a couple of these guys will help us kind of replenish the loss of Hughes and Vreeling and Kempner. And it didn't work. It just didn't work. That's kind of the best way to put it. It just didn't work. So what's next? Well, we already know that 2 players have put their name in the NCAA transfer portal out of Gonzaga. One of them is a pretty tough loss. Cade McGee. Cade McGee played third base for this team last year. He had 293 with a 430 on base percentage. He was second on the team with 6 home runs. He also had 20 RBIs. McGee was also the WCC Freshman of the Year in 2022. He was a D1 baseball freshman All-American. He was one of the best freshmen in the country in 2022. This past season, he didn't play as much. He played a little bit less. He was still very productive as a hitter. He also was a pseudo right-handed pitcher. I think he threw 2 or 3 games as a pitcher. He's transferring as a hitter. I imagine he's transferring as a third baseman. But seeing a guy win WCC Freshman of the Year, play less the following year, not surprising to see him enter the transfer portal. I wish him the best of luck. He was really, really big part of that magical 22 team that went all the way into the regionals. And he was one of the best players on a team that kind of floundered this past year. So hopefully he can find himself a landing spot that really helps him continue to grow as a baseball player and potentially a professional baseball player, because he is that caliber of talent. And it's a tough loss for this team. The next one is Bradley Mullan. Bradley Mullan is one of those relievers that struggled this year, if we're being perfectly honest. He had a 6.69 ERA, 2.11 whip. Whip is walks and hits per inning pitched. Anything over 1.3 is considered pretty bad. His was 2.1. He threw 40 innings. He had 34 strikeouts in 40 innings, as well as 21 walks. Spent the past 3 seasons as a bullpen arm for Gonzaga and is now going to hit the portal and look for somewhere else to play. So for Gonzaga, the next steps are really just figuring out which the pitchers on this team maybe had bad years but have the potential to improve. Which of the guys on this team maybe just aren't cut out to be at this level, whether that's actually cutting them, convincing them to jump into the transfer portal, or just replacing them on the roster as best as possible. Again, I have so much confidence in Coach Harmon to turn this thing around and help this baseball program grow and become a program that is continually in the regionals and continually at the top of the standings of the WCC, because they were there for a few years, and then they just had a bad year. Bad years happen. I think that this is going to turn it around. I think that the transfer portal allows them more opportunities to kind of reshape the roster in a fairly significant way. And I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot for people who watch this baseball team this year. If there's a lot of new names next year, that wouldn't shock me. And it might be the right decision to kind of turn some things around a little bit and shake things up and see if they can find some new blood to come in, and especially on the pitching side, and kind of shake things up a little bit, because I think that this program has the capability to be a perennial WCC powerhouse. And certainly, as we talked about in the first segment, a move to the Big 12 doesn't just impact the men's basketball program. And if it does happen, if the Big 12 move does happen, we're going to talk so much about what it means for men's basketball, but we're also going to talk about what it means for women's basketball. And we're going to talk about what it means for baseball too, because that's a darn good baseball conference. And it's going to help Gonzaga recruit better, being able to sell, hey, we're going out and playing these teams in the Big 12 every single year. I think that's going to help them improve. But they still got to prove that they can, you don't want to go into the Big 12 and immediately finish last. You want to be ready for that level of competition. And I think the Zags, they got some work to do, but I have a lot of confidence in the coaching staff to turn things around and get this program back to where they want to be, either in the WCC or potentially in the Big 12 in the not too distant future. Well, that is going to do it for me today and for this week. Happy Friday, happy June, happy summer to all of you out there listening to the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you to all of you everyday listeners as well. If you want to become an everyday listener, just go hit that subscribe button on YouTube. You can also leave a review on iTunes. You can give me a follow on Twitter there on your screen. Check out the Locked On College Basketball podcast as well for more updates on what is going on around the NCAA and our beloved sport. Thank you all for listening. Have a great weekend, and go Zags.